One of the few men involved in the Lightning project from the earliest days was Wing Commander Roland Beamont, or B to close friends and colleagues. B had been employed by English Electric as chief test pilot for the Canberra project and was the natural choice to head the new fighter test program. He recalls how the Canberra played a part in the origins of the Lightning.
English Electric were tasked at the end of the war with taking on the design of the first British jet bomber, an aeroplane that was going to double the performance of existing bombers in the service. And this was all started up at Preston under the leadership of Teddy Petter, who was the chief engineer. And after about 2 years of design work, the project was coming along very well. It occurred to Teddy Petter and his team that the performance of this new jet bomber was going to be so great that it was going to need a supersonic aeroplane to intercept it. Now, at that time, there was no apparent supersonic fighter under development anywhere in the world. And Teddy Petter said, okay, to his team, we'll scheme one. Over a period of about 18 months, they worked on this in the late 40s, presented a proposal to the Air Ministry, and by 1949 this came back as a development contract on English Electric for the F-2349, which was to be a supersonic research aeroplane with development potential into a true fighter.
One other member of the young, dedicated design team was destined to play a leading role throughout the lifetime of the Lightning project. Freddie Page suddenly found himself head of the design team when Teddy Petter decided to leave English Electric.
Teddy Petter effectively retired from the Wharton design team at the end of 1949, and I was then his deputy and took over from him when we had just flown 4 prototype B1 Canberras. The B1 Canberra, of course, never went into production. The first production Canberra was the B2. It was a jolly good, small team that Teddy Petter had built up. And it was a great privilege to work with them, and I hope for them. At that time, I was 32, and Teddy formally left the English Electric organisation, and I was engaged as chief engineer just about the time of my 33rd birthday. It was a marvellous challenge for a young chap.
It was a period of enormous inspiration, really. I mean, we were involved, as you know, at English Electric with the fairly big, for those days, flight test program on the Canberra jet bomber. And in parallel, we were developing the P1, which was to be the first British supersonic aeroplane. Initially, this was designed to be fully controllable at just a little over the speed of sound. When in the evolution of this design stage of this aeroplane, it became quite apparent with the amount of power that was going to be eventually available to us with the new Rolls-Royce Avon RA-24 engines. This new design would actually be capable of achieving not just the speed of sound, but more than twice the speed of sound. And this was all coming to us in the immediate future, so it was a very exciting time.
This was what they produced, the P1 prototype. On the 4th of August 1954, the P1 made its first flight. Just 7 days later, B and the P1 made history.
On the next flight, we had a nice clear day. We went, climbed up over Swanage, turned east up the channel, set the throttles at full power and a slightly higher altitude this time. And after about 3.5 minutes, we came up against this 0.98 hesitation, held it there for a little longer, and all of a sudden the Mach meter, without any vibration or change in trim of the airplane, the Mach meter jumped to a little bit beyond Mach 1 and we were supersonic. And no drama, nothing at all. Britain had a supersonic airplane.
Ironically, the Minister of Supply was Duncan Sands, who went on to become Minister of Defence. And he had a very clear idea of the future of manned fighters.
The V-1 flying bomb attack was expected, and we were put down on Dungeness specifically to counter that attack. Well, the Tempest was very good at it and soon started scoring highly. Duncan Sands appeared on the scene as an advisor to Prime Minister Churchill. He was tasked with assessing the defences against the flying bomb, making recommendations. He appeared on our airfield one day, and as the chap in charge of flying, I was tasked with showing him round. I told him what we were doing, explained how we were doing it, and he didn't sound terribly enthusiastic. He sounded even less enthusiastic when one of my chaps shot down a V-1 very close to us, and when we picked ourselves out of the ditch and dusted the dust off ourselves, he got up and he looked at his watch and he said, well, I think I've seen all I need to see. It's time I went. And then there was a short pause, and he said, you know, you chaps are all wasting your time. All of this will be done with rockets in the future. That was in 1944. In 1957, when we were in the process of honing this new supersonic Lightning fighter into a potent weapon for the Royal Air Force, and it was going extremely well. We were right in the beginning of the test program on the Lightning itself. We were flying at Mach 2. We were finding the airplane completely controllable. We were just getting into the beginnings of setting up and putting into full working order the complicated radar and weapon system, when the Defence White Paper came out, known ever since as the Sands White Paper, or the Sandstorm, which defined, as far as we could read it, we couldn't believe it, that after the Lightning there would be no supersonic replacement aircraft for the Royal Air Force, and that all defence of the UK would be carried out by missiles in the future. So over 10 years he at least hadn't changed his policy. Development was delayed, interfered with, and finally stopped by lack of government support when it was needed. In projects of this nature, it's impossible for one company to carry out all the developments that are required to obtain the full value out of all the research and development that's gone into it without a backing from one positive customer. Generally speaking, a military airplane, you expect your own government to positively back the project. When the Lightning had demonstrated its extreme capability and its potential for further development, we all expected that positive decisions would be taken to take on the developments for the aircraft in the Royal Air Force, which in turn would make it attractive to overseas buyers and export. This didn't happen. What in fact did happen was a series of the most inexplicable cock-ups, which one doesn't understand to this day. But the airplane was first designed in accordance with requirements in the usual way, and the specification issued, and it called for the weapon system to be a combined system of state-of-the-art missiles, air-to-air missiles, and the latest development of the 30mm Aden cannon. And the Mark 1 and Mark 2 Lightnings were built in this way. Then when the Mark 3 Lightning was about to be put into production with increased power in the engines and improvements in the radar system, the government contract required that the guns were no longer needed and that these would be designed out of the aeroplane. And we were very surprised about this, because this was a very big and expensive aeroplane just to be armed by only 2 missiles. However, we did what we were told, and we put this aeroplane into production with just missiles. About 30 aeroplanes down the production line, the government came on to us and said, yes, but we think we would now like to have guns put back into the Mark III Lightning. And we will have the remainder of the production run of the Mark III Lightning equipped with guns as well as missiles. And we thought, well, there goes a good waste of a very large quantity of taxpayers' money, but we did what we were told. And then we were surprised to learn that, not satisfied with that, they wanted to make the whole run of the Mark IIIs, 30 of which had already been built, up to the new standards. So they then flew one by one their first 30 Mark III Lightnings back to the factory to have the front end pulled apart and guns and ammunition bays put back in until the Air Force finally got a complete series of Mark IIIs with guns.
By the mid-60s, it began to dawn on the government that the age of the manned fighter was here to stay. Although the government was still dragging their heels on extending the Lightning's role, the aircraft was an unmitigated success for the squadrons. B's view of the aircraft was soon to be mirrored by operational pilots.
The Lightning was, from the pilot's point of view, an exceptional design. I think I would describe flying a Lightning as being extremely satisfying because it was a Vice's aeroplane. Despite its enormous power and very high performance, it would behave absolutely predictably. It had very precise controls, just like handling a really good sports or racing car. So it was satisfying from that point of view. And it had all this enormous performance. If we ignore the P-1 research aeroplanes and go to the P-1B Lightning first prototype, which had a vast increase in performance. We started in 1957 with that aeroplane, weighing 29,000 pounds, and in full reheat it had 30,000 pounds of thrust. So that it had a more than 1-to-1 power-to-weight ratio, which in simple terms meant that if you stood it on its tail it would go straight up for a limited distance, but it was almost like a rocket. Now this was most apparent to the pilot right from the start. One Royal Air Force pilot, first time he flew a Lightning, was asked to describe the sensation afterwards, and he said, "Superb. I was with it all the way until I let the brakes off."
For B, there were moments of pure enjoyment amongst the years of flight testing and evaluation.
There are so many things that you could enjoy, and if you were at 30,000 feet on a clear day and you were fed up with doing a gentle cruise back to base, you could roll it inverted, pull it through 45 degrees of a dive at 0.9 Mach number, and have to watch out very carefully that you didn't go supersonic because you'd be pointing towards the land, and go through 25 of those 30,000 feet in about 1 minute and roll out low level. And it was all very exhilarating stuff. Very enjoyable.
In contrast, the battle for export sales wasn't going well. English Electric were trying to sell the Lightning to Germany, and they weren't winning any orders.
No, there was a very good reason for that. It wasn't permitted to. When we were well in the development of the Lightning, and we could see that it was going to meet all its performance requirements, and the Royal Air Force were going to get an airplane of superb controllability, world-beating performance, but with a weapon system that needed further development. We were expecting that development to start. We found it was being backpedaled by the authorities. We weren't getting a go-ahead to develop it. And then we turned our attention with this highly potential airplane to the European market. This was just at the time when the European air forces were developing after the war and wanting to go fully supersonic. And the first one was going to be the Germans. Whoever got into Germany was going to lead all the other nations. We could see that. And so we started offering proposals for development of the Lightning to the German government, West German government. And we got no responses. And after a few weeks and months, with our representatives in Bonn, they came back saying that we're actually not talking to the right people. There's something very strange going on. The Americans are making a lot of headway, but we're not getting through to the right people. And our company made investigations in whatever levels were necessary in London, and came back with the astonishing information that there was a government official in Bonn, in Germany, actively advising the German government that they should not consider the Lightning, as it was not suitable for their requirement. We then carried out further investigation to identify who this person was, and we found that it was in fact a gentleman who later became a junior minister. But against this opposition, of course, the Germans dropped the idea of the Lightning.
Charlie 7 contact.
We knew from the Mark II, which had been designed to defend only the V1 bases in the northeast of England, that the radius of action would be so limited that we would not be able to sell the aeroplane abroad. And we said that, well, no matter what the Air Force requirement is, we need to double the internal fuel capacity if we're going to make this an export success. The official attitude to that was that the Air Force has no requirement. At about the end of this cock-up that I've just described about the guns, the Air Ministry got onto us and said, we would now like the increased fuel capacity put into the Mark III series of Lightnings, and we will now call it the Mark VI. And a certain number of the Mark VIs, with the new increased fuel capacity, will have guns put into the front of the increased capacity long-range tank. This was all at great cost to the taxpayer once again. We did this, and this provided the basis for the increased fuel, which we knew we were going to need for export. On the basis of that, the company then provided a whole series of developments to the Lightning to carry underwing stores, bombs and rockets, reconnaissance cameras, and various other improvements to the airplane, including, of course, the new fuel system. This was offered to the Saudi Arabians, and it became the basis of what's now known as the Al-Yamamah contract of the defense of Saudi Arabia, air defense of Saudi Arabia, based initially on the Lightning, and now running, of course, with the Tornado. None of this would have ever happened if we hadn't funded these developments ourselves. It took to supply the Saudi Arabian Air Force with a force of Lightnings. This was going to take them from a subsonic Air Force to a supersonic Air Force in one step. It had been done before, but not in as basic a desert country as Saudi Arabia, with lack of support facilities. In UK or in America or in France, there was in-depth support technology available. In Saudi Arabia, we would have to import all our support from UK to Saudi Arabia, right the way down, in fact, as we found eventually, to language training for people we employed out there. And it was a big task. It was underestimated in the first instance. We as the suppliers supplied the aeroplanes and the backup technical equipment. The administration out there and on-the-ground training, other than flying training, was put in the hands of another company who very much underestimated the task. Within a few years, it did get very difficult, and this was quickly reflected in low serviceability with the aircraft. Keeping the airplanes in the air became a major problem. This was sorted out by putting out, if you like, strengthening the team, the support activity out there from the UK, with a lot of people who were well experienced in the airplane.
Once the Saudis had let us, with the RAF monitoring team, take over responsibility for the operation, the whole operation, and provide proper servicing facilities, properly trained people, and so on, then the operation very rapidly improved, and became entirely successful.
We then had the Lightnings operating as effectively with about the same number of man-hours per flying hour as the Royal Air Force did in this country. So the problems were partly administrative and partly environmental, and they were both got right. The Lightning introduced a new era in display flying because of this enormous amount of surplus power it had. All Lightning's displays used to begin with this tremendous blast of reheat takeoff, and then instead of just climbing away steadily into the distance before turning around and coming back and starting an aerobatic display, the Lightnings would just be just off the end of the airfield, rotated into the vertical, and they go straight up in a vertical climb to the cloud base. And when you saw 12 airplanes do this in line-stone formation, with all the thunder and roar that went with it, it was really impressive. The P-17 concept was a very, very good one, and if you look at the general arrangement drawings of it, superimposed on a picture of the TSR2, you'll find that outwardly there's very little difference.
The P-17 was to ride piggyback on the P-17D to give it a full vertical takeoff capability. The P-17D, which was powered by no fewer than 70 engines, was to enable the P-17 to take off and land back on the platform in the air.
English Electric had got the measure of the supersonic bomber aspect absolutely right, but their solution to providing the short field takeoff and landing capability with this lifting platform, I think would have been immensely difficult to do, very costly, and I had some doubts as to its practicability. I didn't think it would work.
The P-17D was dropped after the RAF redefined their requirement as OR 343, based solely on the Vickers English Electric submissions. Initially, the enforced amalgamation of the two companies was not welcomed.
Well, frankly, we thought it was absolutely wrong. We thought it was a misjudgment which would lead to cost overrun, delays, unnecessarily complications in working out this very complex design, which could much more easily have been done by one firm as a main contractor. And if that one firm didn't have the total manufacturing capacity to cope with the whole program, then they should have subcontracted it out to the other parts of the industry that could take it on. English Electric were regarded by the rest of the industry as newcomers. The great names, Hawkers, de Havillands, Vickers, Bristols, had been companies existing to way back to World War I and even earlier. English Electric, the name English Electric only came into the general public view after World War II. They had built very successfully a range of Hampden and Halifax bombers under license from Handley Page during the war. And then on the basis of that, a new design team was formed in 1945, specifically to design and build for the RAF its first jet bomber, the Canberra. English Electric were regarded as newcomers by the rest of industry, and I think slightly resented for that. We were strongly in favour of a Rolls-Royce engine, not least because we considered that the Bristol Olympus development wasn't far ahead, and that we would end up with in the classic situation which should be avoided in aircraft development. That's a new design of aeroplane with a new design of engine right from flight one. That complicates the issues. Wherever you can, you should combine a new aeroplane with a well-proven engine. Undoubtedly, the development costs of the Olympus were a big factor in the escalating costs of the program, but much worse than that, in my view, was the unreliability of the engine. We did actually, to use the phrase I have just used, arrive at a classic situation where we had a brand new untried aeroplane with an engine which was not only unproved, it hadn't passed its airworthiness type tests, but it actually had a known catastrophic failure on it, which put the TSR2 prototype at risk when we started flying. One of the most delaying aspects of the program was that many of the subcontractors were working directly with the ministry and not under the control of the central management organization, that is BAC. And this led to complications, misunderstandings, and inevitable delays. I remember one famous occasion when one of the committees that I attended of industry and the ministry officials and civil servants from the establishments and elsewhere. The chairman took a look round the room when we started in St Giles Court, long room, full of cigarette smoke and battered cups of tea. And he took a look round the room. He said, "I want a count taken." And there was a head count taken at this meeting, and there were 58 people in the room. And the chairman quite reasonably said, "This is quite ridiculous. Nobody could control a program with meetings this size. I want you all to go away, and the next meeting is convened for such and such a date, and I want to see a significant reduction in the numbers at that meeting." And in due course, we all came back to the reconvened meeting, and there were 61 in the room. In my own experience, we had cockpit committee meetings which spent days not only just trying to decide where one particular switch should go, but what the caption should be under the switch. And then they decided, against the advice of the operators, in that case me, to put a caption under a vital switch, which made no sense to the aircrew at all. And eventually, before we flew, it had to be changed. And this is a typical example of the very simple, silly delays that occurred in the program. I think it's become very clear since those days that the Americans were primarily very worried about the emergence of TSR2 because they saw it as a direct challenge to the military air supremacy that they were aiming to establish with their F-111 swing-wing low-level attack aeroplane, which was designed for a very similar role to TSR2. It was behind it in time, it ran into enormous technical problems, and it overran its cost predictions very, very greatly. But we know that the Americans thought that the TSR2 was a threat, that if we had been as successful with TSR2 as we had been with its predecessor, the Canberra, which was so good, if you remember, that the Americans themselves bought the Canberra, I think they saw the TSR as a threat to their potential worldwide interest in exporting military airplanes, and they were very anxious to get rid of it. To Canberra with teams from British Aerospace to make presentations on the TSR2 program, during which we understand that they were planning to acquire 30 airframes. Royal Air Force was planning to have 150, and this 30 would have made a nice addition to and made the production run really stable. During the early part of 1964 was the year in which the airplane first flew. We understood that the Australian government had virtually signed up for a contract for TSR2.
Mountbatten, perhaps TSR2's most determined critic, was still pushing hard for the Buccaneer. He visited Australia and met their Defence Minister, Sir Frederick Sherger.
He said that it would, he went round the place saying that it was absolutely what the Air Force wanted, and everybody knew this, and he used to go around with a briefcase with one model of the TSR2 and 5 of the Buccaneers and put them on the table in front of people like Sherger in Australia and say, you can have 5 of these for 1 of those, so why do you bother? And by the time we started flying in August, we had been given to understand that the Australians were almost certainly shifting and going for the F-111. Don Bowen, my observer, backseater, and I were the people on whom the total responsibility of this enormous pyramidal organization were going to fall on Flight 1. But it wasn't a sudden precipice to go over. We'd been doing taxi trials on the aeroplane, testing all its systems out on the ground. We'd taxied it up to takeoff speed, tested the parachute, the brakes and all the rest of it. By the time we were ready to fly on that day, I had any doubts about the capability of the aeroplane had long since gone. I was very confident that it was going to fly well. It's an extraordinarily good moment when you turn onto the runway, you call for clearance to go, you get clearance from the tower, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, brakes off. You light the reheat and go, and from then on, you know exactly what it's supposed to do, and your task is just to be totally alert to see if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's a fascinating moment, it's professionally enormously satisfying. And then when you become airborne and you find this new device actually performs as well as predicted, or even in the case of TSR2 better, to fly the TSR2 first flight for 30 minutes. We in fact flew for 27 minutes. Halfway through that, at the end of the first circuit round Boscombe, I had formed the opinion that this was far more than a questionable aeroplane. This was a brilliant first attempt at getting this complex aeroplane right. It was so good and so right on Flight 1 after 10 minutes that I was enjoying the sensation of just relaxing and feeling this is a marvelous aeroplane. I felt I'd been there before.
The first flight had demonstrated the potential of the aircraft, but for technical reasons it was not to fly again until the very last day of the year. In the meantime, there'd been a change of government. Flying will invariably throw up the occasional dramatic moment.
That was a one-off. It was a pilot on his first flight on the aeroplane. The runway for a fraction of a second.
The very nature of test flying will invariably throw up the occasional dramatic moment. Flying will invariably throw up the occasional dramatic moment.
That was a one-off. It was a pilot on his first flight on the aeroplane. He hadn't quite understood the dynamics of the aeroplane, and he'd got his approach slightly wrong, and he touched down at a very high rate of descent. When we got to flight 20, I think it was, up at Wharton, we were clear of all the minor snags on the aeroplane, and we thought now's the time to get on to curing this or investigating this undercarriage problem. The first thing to do was to measure the difference between touching down on a dry runway and touching down on a very reduced coefficient of friction runway, low mu. That was obtained by getting the fire brigade to spread foam on the runway, and Jimmy Dell touched down on the foam with the onboard vibration sensors measuring the vibration set up at that point, and they were then directly compared with the similar vibrations caused on touching down on a dry runway. That was all part of the research to get that one right. It became apparent that the next and vital stage of the flight development of the aeroplane was going to need expertise, knowledge and facilities which didn't exist at the Weybridge end of the consortium. They existed in large measure at Wharton, and this type of aeroplane was right within Wharton's expertise. So it gradually became apparent in the management of the program that thinking changed towards moving the first prototype and the subsequent flight development, which was going to be at least 3 years and 3,500 hours of testing in toto up to Wharton, under the charge of Freddie Page, who was the chief designer.
Flight 14 was not simply a return home. Roland Beamont, having satisfied himself that the aircraft was performing as planned, took TSR2 supersonic for the first and only time. Engaging reheat on just one engine, the acceleration was such that he left Jimmy Dell behind, even though he had engaged full reheat on both Avon engines of his Lightning.
This new aeroplane was, despite its difficulties, despite its management problems, despite the rather unpleasant and hazardous faults that had occurred in some of the first few flights, it was now showing itself to be a tremendous thoroughbred. It was going to be a wonderful aeroplane. It was already extraordinarily satisfying to fly as a professional. I had been looking forward enormously to shaking the dust of Boscombe off my feet figuratively and flying this aeroplane back to my own base, where even the voice of the air traffic controllers were my friends. And we flew back into that environment, we brought it home, and now we were going to get on with it, and no holds barred. It was a very good feeling. Not just a feeling of inevitability. We'd been struggling. We'd put every possible effort, and when I say we, I mean the whole workforce, all the engineers, the ground staff, the aircrew, of course, the flight developers, the airworthiness people, administrators backing it all up, had been working on an all-hours basis. There was no knock-off time. You worked on through the night. Leave was cancelled. Family arrangements were disrupted. Tensions developed in families because husbands were overworked, overstressed. This had been going on for years. All the knowledge and the potential knowledge to be gained from these things, and also, of course, with an eye on trying to keep people in employment, not only in our factories, but in the component factories, the suppliers. We put forward a program to the ministry within 2 weeks of cancellation, proposing that the two prototypes should be kept on, I think, a 100-hour test and development program for research into the future Concorde test program, because they're very similar types of airplane. Much valuable information could be gained, and I think we put it forward on the basis of a fixed price contract. We were asking for £1.5 million to do 100 hours of concentrated research. Massive publicity was given, obviously with official blessing, to operatives in our factories who had actually built these airframes, dragging them out onto the tarmac, shoving oily rags in them and setting fire to them, particularly to the magnesium areas, which burnt like a holocaust. I know then that I just had the immense dramatic task of inviting some hundreds of my staff to consider the fact that they were going to be made redundant. And all these dedicated people of high skills were just shown their cards, and many of them went to America, of course. It's 30 years now, and nobody has ever in that time given me a clear and reasonable explanation of why it was cancelled. A bridge too far. I think it was a very ambitious, expensive, and at the same time extremely capable military aeroplane, which was perhaps too far advanced for our Air Force and our Ministry of Procurement to cope with. The concept was probably too great for them. They hadn't grown up. They should have done. You know, it's all been done since, and we'd got a long way to doing it then. But this was actually fundamentally lack of faith in the ability of our aircraft industry to produce those sort of goods. We were, in fact, leading the world at the time, but the actions of the politicians made sure we would never do it again.